Hello and welcome to Breathing Underwater's Musicast, episode number 10. In this episode we are going to dissect the evolution of metal from our perspective now that Sam Dunn's Metal Evolution on VH1 has concluded. And we are then going to talk about an album called Everything is Changing from an artist that I can't pronounce her name, but she was the former singer of The Gathering.
Let's just call her Anneke.
We'll talk a little bit about some metal shows we've been to. And then we're going to recommend some stuff. And by the way, we're paring things down, getting back to basics here. This is just Dave and me. And we'll probably be doing more episodes like this because it's been quite an effort trying to rally Jay and Chris and Nat and Kel and all the other people and guests that we've had on lately. So we're just going to try to keep things simple for the time being, just two of us. And we were both avid viewers of Sam Dunn's VH1 Metal Evolution show, and we had there was a lot of fodder based on that we were wanted to talk about because it really spoke to a lot of the evolution that Dave and I went through growing up and becoming metalheads. So Dave, let's talk about that a little bit. Let's talk about first let's talk about Sam's show a little bit before we go off on our own tirade. And just what we thought about it in general now that it's run its course, at least the first season, if there's going to be another season.
Yeah.
Don't know. So what did you think about it as a whole?
I loved it. It was, I can't believe something on that subject would play on a major network like VH1. I thought VH1 followed MTV and became another reality show channel. But I guess not completely. I don't know. There's so much to talk about. It's hard to say. What I gotta recommend is if you haven't seen it, if you like heavy music or edgy rock in any way, you have to see it. It's the history of heavy metal in all forms, from the beginning to present. So you have to go see it. You have to see it if you like heavy music in any way. And
it was nice just because he really paid. It was a very respectful view of it because, a lot of, like, VH1 has done a couple metal shows. Sometimes we'll get those talking heads of people that are like some Rolling Stone editor and some like VJ person and some guy off the street or something, and they get them together in a room or whatever, and they just talk about like the 100 greatest moments in metal or something. Like, they've done a few of those, but they're like ridiculous.
They would
and
focus on metal.
Yeah, and that's what I was gonna say. Is like usually when they do talk about metal, they're usually talking about like 80s or Metallica stuff. Like the kind of metal that people think of when they think of metal, not all the other nuanced movements that have happened throughout its run. So yeah, like it was just cool that Sam was looking at it not just from a anthropologic viewpoint, and but he was looking at it from a he was a real fan. He wasn't just some producer that was doing something that he thought was gonna get some ratings. Like, he was really doing something he wanted to do. It was like a real passion project of his, and it was cool that he paid it a real scientific or anthropologic perspective. That he didn't just kind of. Also, he didn't just like fawn over all, like, well, these are all my favorite bands and this is why they're cool, like a lot of those talking head VH1 shows do and stuff. It was much more thought provoking and and respectful and interesting. I was just gonna say that, like, I thought he did a really, really good job of kind of following the metal timeline from its early like roots and early influences, and then he kind of went along with deviated here and there, but he mostly went along with like the timeline of like every episode was like the next big movement that happened in metal until he got to new metal. And I don't want to say I was disappointed necessarily, because all the other episodes after that were still really good, in and of themselves. Like, all the episodes held together really well. As like those could have been like VH1 specials all in of them, in of themselves. But in terms of like the arc of the show, he didn't continue with the timeline really after the new metal one. He kind of skipped the last 10 or 12 years of evolution, and I was just a little off put by that because I thought that I was really I mean he mentioned like Lamb of God
And it
in
showed Kerry King sitting around with Lamb of God and talking about how, like, these young guys are doing thrash these days, so we better step up his game again.
right yeah so maybe was it the thrash episode or was it whatever
That
but
was the first episode, yeah, because we kind of went to modern times, where's thrash now, and
so that
he
was
just did that in every episode.
yeah, but that was in regards to thrash. Like he was specifically talking about current stuff in regards to thrash. He wasn't
Yeah.
talking about just the current movement. So I don't know. I thought like the shock rock and the what was the other ones he did after he did shock rock. And then he did power metal
Progress.
and then prog. Yeah, like all of those were definitely like noteworthy and worth talking about. But I don't know. I'm just wondering why he didn't continue and at least just do one episode about everything that's been happening since all the like the new wave of American heavy metal, like God Forbid, Lamb of God kind of bands.
That's fitting.
Yeah, and like Kill Switch and stuff. Like why he didn't talk about that, and then he could have even done like a half episode and then done like power metal or something. But I mean, I know power metal is really important to the story of metal, and it was like it's super popular in Europe, but like a whole episode about that, I didn't know if that was really necessary. So that was kind of my
Yeah.
take on the show. Like as a whole, I thought it kind of just lost steam in terms of where it started, but otherwise I thought it was really good.
You need to have ended with the new wave of American metal, which is this what was called metalcore, Lamb of God, and Unearth, and God Forbid, and all Kill Switch. Like, you need to talk about all that. Talk about how like the thrash sound like made a huge resurgence. And he could have mentioned hardcore. Like hardcore metal from the late '90s, Hatebreed and all the. I felt that needed at least a mention.
I was wondering why he didn't do that. And my guess is that hardcore was never mainstream enough, except for maybe like
Yeah.
Hatebreed, But
But metal. But I think the whole metalcore and everything, all this core stuff. There is all these bands look to hardcore, were influenced by hardcore as well as old school thrash and kind of. And there's a lot of black metal in, some death metal and extreme metal into that, and all this stuff came together. That I think a lot of this was brewing during the new metal days. It was like we're real metal, we're ready to like come back,
Yeah, and that's true. Like if he had done an episode about the new wave of American metal, he couldn't have missed out on hardcore because, all these bands, including Lamb of God, like they are definitely like mostly thrash influenced and some death metal and everything that you said, but there's definitely hardcore influence because all these bands incorporate breakdowns, and you can't deny like that hardcore had an influence of I mean all these bands like incorporate break, and now we've already done our insane core episode, but I think that's kind of more the current. I think that's actually overshadowed the all the Unearths and God Forbid. Like I don't think God Forbid and Unearth and Killswitch are any more prominent now than like a lot of these like Devil Wears Prada and Suicide Silence kind of bands. Like those insane core bands, like they are like directly influenced by hardcore, and it's so obvious.
So they're like lesser versions of. I liked how he mentioned Dillinger.
Yeah, I was really appreciative of that too. You know what I thought it was funny? The way he talked about Dillinger was the exact way that I talked about Dillinger when I saw them. When I saw Dillinger at the Cavalera Conspiracy show, I think it was 2009 in Baltimore.
Yeah.
I had never seen them before, but I'd heard about their, legendary chaos. And yeah, like I was like everything that he said about Dillinger was like verbatim of what I said after I saw him. I was like I was scared for the fans, for the people that were near the front. I thought everybody was like going to get decapitated by the guitarist spinning the guitars around and stuff. Like they were crazy, and it was awesome.
Man, it's total jazz metal.
Yeah,
crazy metal.
I mean, he called him prog. I always call him like infusion, but maybe I'm thinking more like Candiria though. Like they were definitely more of an infusion band.
Yeah.
But anyway, so so the show had its pros and cons, but it was overall like a great show. Nothing like it has ever been out there, and it was great that somebody finally paid that level of like respect, on a mainstream cable television to go so far as to put metal up at the same pedestal as like jazz and classical and pop and R&B and what have you. Um, but watching that show got a lot of discussion going between Dave and myself and our friends. So that's what we really want to talk about was our own personal evolution and story and journey. Where do you want to start with this, Dave? Do you want to? Well, in the first episode, we basically we described in general like where we were coming from, with our musical tastes, like how we started out, and where we ended up and the stuff we like now. So I don't think we really need to cover that again. But what do you want to talk about in relation to the show? What was burning on your mind?
Well, Dan, I just quick go back to the history of metal. I wanted to say that I've always, growing up or younger, I always thought of like the centrum of which all metal emerged from. I thought it was okay. I thought everything was like proto metal or primordial metal until thrash came about. I thought like the heavy metal thing may have been thrown around, but for some reason I never thought that metal was really metal until thrash happened. It was a big eye opener to realize that metal and the whole attitude of metal was way before thrash.
Yeah, even like in the 70s.
Yeah, I mean I knew there was harder bands. I knew it was acid rock or hard rock or whatever you want to call it. The more edgy artists from back then. But I never thought, I always thought, when I thought metal as like the most purest form of distilled metal, I always thought thrash.
Yeah, me too.
I didn't think Maiden, Maiden, yeah. But Priest and some of these other artists, I just, I always saw them as like hard rock and kind of proto metal-ish and I don't know, Motorhead and all that. I thought them as like they all predated their influence thrash. But no, metal came way before thrash.
Well, I think Sam made that point too. That like a lot of the bands an artist that he discussed and interviewed in regards to the story of metal weren't necessarily metal bands themselves necessarily. And some of them other people considered metal or metal influence, but a lot of times they didn't consider themselves metal. But the reason that he included a lot of that stuff was just because it had an undeniable influence on different subgenres of metal. So
definitely,
there's that. Like you said, I don't think all of those bands were considered metal bands at the time. I don't know if anybody said, "Oh, Motorhead is like a great metal band." I think, like you said, they were like a hard rock band. But now we look back, and that's the cool thing about looking at it the way Sam did, like as an anthropologist, he's looking back over an evolution of something and he's kind of putting the pieces together. It's like a big puzzle. I think that's what made the show really interesting. Was like, oh yeah, like totally, I wouldn't have thought of that, but that all played into the same pot,
Mhm.
So, but let's talk about us a little bit, Dave. We don't talk about us enough. Where are we at with this in terms of the stuff that the show kind of brought up? We had lots of discussions about that. I think one of the big ones was let's talk about the grunge thing, because there was a lot of stuff in the show that definitely piqued our interest and that kind of put some puzzle pieces together. But I think it was the grunge episode where we were both kind of like, whoa, there's something more personal going on here with where we are coming from in music. And I think where it started was that you and I never looked at grunge as having anything to do with metal. And he even mentions that in that grunge episode, that like grunge was, for a lot of grunge artists, was a direct opposition to like what was going on with metal, like the end of the hair metal days. Like that, a lot of grunge, like they were the furthest thing from metal as you could. But what was interesting though about grunge in terms of metal was that Dave and I both, like, the first rock album that we got together was Pearl Jam 10, and then like we got into Foo Fighters and Nirvana. Not that I would call Foo Fighters grunge, but
remember Nirvana's Aneurysm single?
Yes,
I remember we got that about the same time as Pearl Jam.
I do remember that, and we got into grunge first. That was kind of like the end of grunge was pretty much happening when we were getting into music in middle school, and we were introduced to like the grunge stuff and the early alternative, and I just think it's interesting in terms of like evolution of our tastes. Started with grunge, but then kind of organically went towards metal because as soon as we were kind of like exploring further, once we got into all those mainstream grunge bands, well, the next mainstream band that came our way was Metallica, and they are not, they weren't too hard, but they were hard enough to be, like the next stepping stone. And then I think after that was like Pantera, and then the rest is history. It was like once we got there,
Yeah.
we were kind of open to everything. So yeah, let's talk about the grunge thing for a second, just because I think we both found that all kind of fascinating. What were your thoughts on grunge? And watching that episode inspired you to go out and look at some bands that you never even knew about or knew about in terms of grunge, right? So talk about that for a second.
Well, I have a bunch of views on grunge. Theories on them too. I feel that a lot of things kind of came together, attitudes, reactions, to make what we call grunge, at least the earlier more pure sound of grunge. I feel like there was a lot to it, like metal and thrash and alternative, 80s alternative, punk, of course. A lot of things came together, a lot of attitudes, reactions, and it all, well, of course, it was a micro scene up in Seattle. I think because of that eclecticism to its origins, grunge had at least two streams. I see two streams within it. There's one of the heavier scene, more driving from metal, or a minimalist, anti-rock star metal attitude, and a more like alternative view. It had more punk and 80s alternative. Sometimes I think Cheap Trick when I think of this, and of course, you got Neil Young that was Pearl Jam, and I'm sure people who are more learned in music know a lot more artists, but I've seen two streams, and the reason I believe grunge became seen as more of like a alternative scene when it became more mainstream was Nirvana. Nirvana had metal influences, definitely. You could see that, of course, in Bleach and in Utero, where it's just a heavier, darker, edgier emphasis. But Kurt Cobain was very much influenced by punk rock. So Nirvana had a little bit more of that punk rock edge to it, as opposed to, like, let's say, Soundgarden and Cad and, Melvins. Melvins are kind of proto-grunge. But so Nirvana got associated with, like, the figureheads of grunge. They were the main grunge band, Kings of or wherever. So, and then it became, more popular alternative, and everybody looked at grunge as that music that basically came from other bands, but it basically came from Nirvana. That's the way it was seen in, let's say, folk culture, which isn't true, but I think that's the reason we saw it that way. But if you look back, I mean, Stone Temple Pilots have some. They do the heaviness in an interesting way, where it's that crunch grunge sound, high treble, high mid, low treble, kind of very high gain sound. I actually really like that sound almost more than like a lot of metal guitar sounds. Something that's kind of like a blah, anything goes, screw it all kind of attitude or sound. It's easy to see how like more that stream of more alternative and punk influence grunge overshadowed the heavier, edgier ones that was harder to go mainstream, So that's what I think of grunge. I also want to say quickly another connection I had is I think the grunge sound, that heaviness, that did not rely on palm muting and muting, the low E chord for heaviness. I believe that influenced the new metal sound. They just took that sound to a more of an extreme. Or if you think anything about that.
So you think that new metal was partially born out of grunge?
Maybe not new metal as a movement, but I think the guitar sounded.
I never would have noticed that, but I'm also not a guitar player, so.
Listen to old EP, listen to Bleach, listen to like a lot of Melvins. Listen to like that stuff. Listen to the harder edge of grunge, and you hear a new metal type of sound where it's heavy and edgy without having to be that thrash relying on the E and shredding. It's like a low. It's like it could be down tuned or just have that blag. Think of Korn. Think of how muddy Korn, that muddy, crunchy sound. I think they influenced the guitar sound.
Well, I mean, Korn's first album came out in '94 when grunge was still around, technically.
Yeah.
So I wonder, and you know what? Like, didn't Monkey and a couple other guys, they were in like a band called LAPD. I think the LAPD was before Korn. I think they were kind of grungy. I have their cassette tape somewhere. I have to go listen to it again.
To hear that.
I don't think I listened to it like once, but yeah. So I mean, I can totally see that like just in terms of sound, maybe not attitude or image or anything, but the sound was definitely influenced by the grunge guitarist. I think too. I mean, you can definitely hear a metal influence from grunge in, like you said, like in like Nirvana's Bleach, especially like in the percussion. And then I had never heard of Tad before. I'm really glad that he introduced me to them because I think Tad is awesome. And the Melvins, like I knew about the Melvins. I had a couple of their albums, but I wasn't really into them. But yeah, they like the percussion and the bass playing. Just apart from the guitars, like you can like just with the double bass and like the really kind of like hard hitting in your face kind of stuff. Even Dave Grohl, even though Dave Grohl wasn't on the first Nirvana album, but he too was like, actually if you ever remember Probot, he wrote a whole metal album, and he was
one of the heavy music. I mean,
yeah. Did you see him wearing a Slayer t-shirt at the Grammys the other day?
Oh, did he?
Yeah, he did. I thought that was kind of funny. I don't really like Dave Grohl like in Foo Fighters. I don't care for his vocal stylings or his guitar playing very much, but I do really respect him because of like Probot and because of Nirvana and because he obviously he's like I love his drum play. I think he's a great drummer. He's just so
definitely.
He's just so in your face about his drum playing, but I think Kurt was quoted once as saying that, like, they asked him about what he thought about Dave Grohl's playing. He's like, well, he definitely hits really hard. So anyway, yeah. So in terms of us though, like the grunge thing, like I said before, I thought was interesting because I just think it was kind of cool that Sam noted grunge in terms of metal, because that got me thinking about how we got into metal, and obviously it was born out of our introduction to grunge, and I think that's really cool how that kind of validated that, and Sam's show kind of validated us, and where we, it wasn't like a big leap that we went from listening to like Nirvana and Pearl Jam and Soundgarden and STP and everything to going to Metallica and Pantera. But I was also thinking that it's interesting that I think we were kind of lucky, like when we got into music, just that time period where like kind of the mid to late 90s, because there was a lot of different things happening all at once. Grunge was dying, alternative was rising, new metal was rising, and and thrash was kind of going out, but it was still like iconic, So we kind of had a lot of different influence, or we had different avenues to explore kind of all at once.
Yep.
As opposed to Sam, who I thought was interesting because a lot of the reason that he explored some of these other genres, like the reason that he looked into grunge and new metal and power metal and like shock rock, was because he didn't like them.
Yeah.
And but he knew that they were an important part of the story, so he looked into them, and I feel like we were kind of lucky as opposed to him, because he was coming up with thrash, and like all he had was like thrash and hair metal. Like that's it. I don't think he didn't even know about like death metal at the time, even though it was there, but it was really underground, like bands like Venom and stuff.
You say he eventually got into extreme metal.
Yeah, he said he did eventually, but like when he started as a kid, like when he was our age, he didn't have. I just don't think he had as many choices. I think he kind of had like, he had like Metallica and Exodus and Testament, and then like Poison and Quiet Riot and stuff. But you and me, like we had everything from Pearl Jam to Pantera, to like Static X and Soulfly. Like we had a lot of diversity in our music, and I think that really kind of helped shape our taste because then it kept us open. Like we were into like a lot of different kinds of stuff and different influence stuff, and then you and I were able to
Uh-huh.
kind of go out after our initial kind of kid phase of exploring music and still be appreciative of and open to a lot of different kinds of things. Like you got into punk and you got into like R&B and hip hop. You got into some like interesting stuff, and then then your taste helped influence my taste a little bit too because I would have never got into punk if you didn't.
Yeah, yeah.
So I'm just like appreciative of when we got into music as opposed to Sam, who I just don't think had as many tastes on his palate as we did. If I may.
Yeah, so we never ended up straight purists. Like, I think there's a tendency these days, especially, it's a good thing where there's not this purist form of music that everybody's got to get into. It's such a plethora these days.
Yeah.
Most metalheads these days, they like emo too, and they like hip hop, and there's a big. It's more accepted to like different genres and mix them and stuff.
Uh-huh.
Ever used to be.
Well, and I thought it was funny even when we were kids. It was like it was harder to define really what defined you as like a metalhead because some metalheads were really into new metal, but other metalheads were remember Rob. I don't want to say his last name, but remember our friend Rob that was like really into like he was all goth and into Cradle of Filth. Oh, and then there was like Marilyn Manson. Like all the kids that were considered the freaks. That were into Marilyn Manson. But then there was like you and me that weren't really into that stuff, but we were still into like
Yeah.
we were at the same time we're like into White Zombie and Deftones and Limp Bizkit and Metallica. Like I said, our palette was really diverse. Yeah, we weren't like you couldn't pigeonhole yourself as a metalhead. So yeah, I feel kind of lucky about that. The other thing I wanted to say, just based on like a thought that I had based on watching the Metal Evolution series, was that I just found it really interesting. Like Sam really brought the point up, and I think he made it really well that a lot of these movements, like all of them, really. I mean, because he really just focused on the mainstream movements, like the new wave of British heavy metal, and then glam metal and grunge and even thrash and new metal and shock rock. Like all of those genres became like they started out as a rebellion. Like it was like, oh, we don't like what the mainstream thing that's happening right now. Like thrash versus glam. But then somebody like down the line that rebellion became popular, and then the record companies picked it up and they started emulating it, and like kind of factory, like just churning it out to the point that it became the next mainstream thing, and then that mainstream thing that used to be the rebellion, became like it created a new rebellion, and then like grunge was born because thrash and glam got way too big for itself, and then so on. Like I just think it's really interesting how like the rebellion becomes the man, and then creates like a new younger generation of rebellion. Because like look at what happened with new metal, like Korn. They were brand new. Like they were doing something that nobody was doing. With the seven strings and everything, and now, or at least towards like the late '90s, early 2000s, like how many bands had a DJ and a seven-string guitar? It was so overblown, like everybody was doing it. And then a lot of bands were like, well, screw it, we're gonna go back to basics, and just do. And then I think that's kind of what bore like Lamb of God and God Forbid and those bands were just like, we're just gonna do it as a 4-piece or 5-piece, and we're not gonna put any frills on it. It's just gonna be what it is,
It's funny because like the minimalist guitarist with new metal was like almost rebellion against the super guitarist thing of the crazy super complex guitar of thrash and stuff. But kind of like how punk was like a rebellion against all the guitar heroes of the '70s. We had to be this like insane artist who's so technical and talented. Punk was like anybody can play it. It's minimalist, kind of like how grunge was. It's like in the minimalist movement, then it's bit back to complexity and the new wave of metalhead. But I did feel like there was this brewing, like bands like Soulfly and stuff. There was like this brewing, like we really want to do thrash. And like once the opportunity is, we're doing our own thing, but we're gonna do we're really gonna hit thrash once we can.
Yeah, but like I said before, I think it's interesting because it feels like Max was when he was kind of I mean, dude, like, limitations breed creativity, and I think sometimes when artists they don't have any limitations or any boundaries, it's just not as good because
Yeah.
yeah, like you said, I mean, now like Max can do whatever he wants because thrash is popular again, and he's making the thrash albums,
Hmm.
and they're not bad, but like in my opinion, the stuff that he was doing, like the early Soulfly, the late Sepultura and early Soulfly stuff, was like his best material because he was kind of fitting more into a mold. And I, and Machine Head too, like the Burning Red, I think was a phenomenal album.
Yeah.
Maybe not a phenomenal Machine Head album, but it was a great album, and I think it was written so well because they were kind of trying to fit with the trend or fit with the mold, and like that made them. But they also still wanted to be, they didn't want to just completely like morph into something they weren't. It was kind of like treading that territory. Like we're gonna do something that's gonna sell, but we also want to do something that's true to us. And to me, that bores like more that creates more creativity than
Hmm.
than when you can just do whatever you want. Because now Max is just like, all right, now I can just play thrash death stuff, and like his lyrics
Yeah.
are like diminishing down and just complete gibberish, and like the songs are just wild. I don't want to keep ragging on
I'm sorry.
Max.
Soulfly's that thrash album is my favorite. Is Dark Ages.
Yeah, oh,
Yeah, I
yeah.
just love that album.
Well, it's because the Dark Ages was kind of like a culmination of everything they'd done. It was like
Hmm.
it had all the best parts of Sepultura and Soulfly.
Oh yeah.
I think that was about all I had for that. Do you have any other thoughts on the whole?
I don't want to like say something about Iron Maiden. Like I could never like place them like what the hell they were. Like their sound was like almost thrash, but
Yeah.
it wasn't. It was like melodic, and they didn't ride the E chord like a thrash band, but they did kind of shred a little bit, and they do. So I could never. They always confused me. They always like blew my mind. I'm like, dude, they're like not. Of course, I'm a guitar player, so I always focus on the guitars. But
Yeah.
I'm like, dude, it's like not riding the E chord like thrash, but it creates thrash, but it's kind of like more melodic than they do other. I don't know what they are.
So did Sam help you define that?
Yeah. It's just me. It's like it's my whole thing thinking that the centrum of metal was always thrash, but wasn't.
Well, yeah. So you got to get over your own personal bias, huh?
The Army is quite actually more and more these days. I used to like abhor like the operatic vocals, but now it's kind of cool. I'm actually starting to listen to experimenting with some goth metal, which I thought was black metal. Black metal is supposed to. My assessment is that black metal is death metal, except they scream high, and they sing about Satan instead of serial killers like death metal, weird death metal.
I just got to say that I had a hard time with Cradle of Filth, even though like I thought they had some pretty wicked like riffs and breakdowns, and like they were really heavy parts, and then the guy would scream like a pterodactyl, and it just didn't sit with me very well. But no offense to Cradle of Filth fans.
I can just start to get into that a little bit. The high scream,
The oh, man.
maybe a little more than maybe because it borders a little bit on like kind of like that what I've heard called the puke scream, the high hardcore scream.
Oh yeah.
I think of All Out War, but they're kind of like a black metal hardcore band. A hardcore band with a little bit of a black metal edge.
Huh. I never really thought about that. All right, let's talk about the former singer of The Gathering's current solo album. So, Dave and I just recently discovered that I knew that she had left the band. How do you say her name, Dave?
Anneke van Giersbergen.
Yeah, so there's, and speaking of a band that had some evolution, so there's The Gathering, and they started out with a male singer, I believe, and they were kind of like a death metal goth whatever band way back,
Oh,
like in the like the mid '90s or
yeah.
something, and then they picked up Anneke, which we're pronouncing wrong, and they still had that black metal kind of progressive sound going, but then they were definitely like very melodic, and she was such a strong singer with such an amazing range that they it seemed like she kind of really pushed their boundaries, because every album they would get a little bit more tone, like they toned down their sound in terms of like epicness, but then her vocals were just so epic to me that I thought they never really lost that kind of core just hugeness to their sound. Even with their smallest, most minimalist songs, like just her and a piano, but she is so big, you know, like something about her vocal capacity just always kind of stuns me. When I listen to The Gathering, even like their little harder stuff, to me it's very almost like meditative music. Not in a background like, world music kind of way or something where you just put on like a soundscape music just to, in the background, but like
Yeah.
her stuff just makes me want to like sit and listen. So yeah, so she left The Gathering in what, 2007, I guess, to pursue a solo career and be a mother or something, raise a family. I don't know. I didn't even realize that she had been putting out material. I guess I wasn't following close enough. So she put out 2 albums, and then she put out her most recent album just last month called Everything Is Changing, and we got it. And I think it's safe to say that we both love it, right?
Mhm.
I'm really impressed. Like I thought that the first one that we got, Air, was could have easily been like the next Gathering album. It was very much in line with everything that the Gathering had been doing, from in my opinion. But I was really surprised by this one because it's definitely not like Gathering. It doesn't, to me, it doesn't really ring of the Gathering very much, just in terms of like their kind of tone and scope. But there's some songs on there that are kind of borderline heavy, and I was surprised by that because every time like an artist splits from a band to go solo, I just assume they want to do more singer-songwritery stuff, like softer, lighter,
Yeah.
more personal stuff. But she kind of was like bringing the rock on this last one. I was impressed. What did you think about it?
I really like the first song, and she did a song called "Take Me Home." There's a video with her just like dancing with this guy, and like it almost seems like she's trying to like appeal to pop, like in like a more mainstream pop kind of way. But when you start listening to the album, it's like it gets heavier, like almost like the old Gathering, and it's not the same, but it's not as dark as stuff she's done in the past. So it's a good break. When I think the Gathering, they were great, but they kind of like they've done the same similar stuff. Like the new Gathering album, I love the new singer. She's not Anneke, but she's her own thing.
Yeah.
A little more subtle and femme kind of sounding, but a little less projected. But it's really good stuff. But Gathering just like they're just repeating. They've kind of made their point, especially after the last album with Anneke Home. The slow progressive, seems like every album's just similar feel, and I'm happy this new her and Anneke's latest album is just great. It's very dynamic.
Yeah, that's a good word for it, dynamic.
She's a singer that like there's some there's female singers in that type of music and rock but she's someone who's like she's a talent. She's like a prodigy of vocals. Like a rare singer that just can like. And you see her live time. She does the same vocal range. She doesn't sound anywhere more raw, but it's a phenomenal voice. Just like people listening like, whoa. I've heard, like, damn, she's good. Highly recommend her stuff. Always recommend people check out The Gathering. They're the only band that's ever been grouped into prog rock. I've heard them grouped into goth rock, goth metal too.
Let's talk about live music for a second. Chris and I reviewed the Machine Head show that we went to on our last episode. So I had a thought about just the vibe of the show and metal shows in general. And I was just thinking back to like our original experiences going to like heavy shows, especially around the DC Baltimore area, around high school and then the college age when new metal was still very popular, and the shows just tended to be a little bit more, packed tight. And I was just thinking about that in terms of like the metal shows that I've been to, in like the past decade or so. And there's a few factors that I thought were interesting that kind of played into the whole metal, the evolution of metal kind of thing a little bit. One of them is, obviously the economy was better about, 10, 15 years ago. And so that means, people were spending more money going to more concerts. And then also, new metal was hugely mainstream. So obviously those like a lot more people were probably going to metal shows, especially the more popular bands at the time. And then also we were a little bit younger back then, and we were following the bands that were popular at the time. And then so since then I've been still following those bands. Like I've gone to several Soulfly shows, Machine Head shows, and Fear Factory and bands like that. Bands that were like obviously way more popular 10 years ago than they are now, even though they're still able to draw a crowd. But so going to the Machine Head show a couple weeks ago, and I was looking around at the crowd, and for a second I was really hoping that it would be more like it was back in the day when we'd go to metal shows and it'd be sold out, and it was just everybody was there for the headlining band, and everybody was just super stoked. It was just like a great vibe, it was just like energy in the air, and people were like moshing when there was no music playing, in between acts and stuff. People were so excited, and and then like when Soulfly would come on, like the whole place would be bouncing up and down and stuff. Like it was so much fun and like such a great vibe. And I'm just remembering a lot of the metal shows that I've been to in the past decade, and then culminating with the Machine Head show, which obviously like people were there for a good metal show. People were there to see Machine Head. It was not. I wouldn't say it was a thin crowd. It definitely wasn't sold out, but it was it was like at a club, fit a good, I don't know what, like 800 people or less. I don't know. Some your normal kind of regular club size venue in Norfolk, Virginia. But it was, I don't know, I felt like the crowd was like there was a lot of people just standing around watching. Even during like some of their more popular songs like 10 Ton Hammer and stuff. And I had a lot of experiences as a kid just being towards the front, just jammed up, and you couldn't move, and you just jumping up and down only because everybody else is jumping up and down, and you weren't, it was too crowded to mosh. And like I'm just remembering like how much fun that was. And not to say that like the show the other night or a lot of the shows that I've been to over the years have not been awesome, but like I'm just kind of considering what's happened in the evolution of metal over the years. Like is it that metal itself is just not as popular as it was, or is it am I going to the shows, the wrong kind of shows that aren't as packed? Like I'm just wondering, what I'm saying, Dave? Like are there metal bands that you can go see now, except for like Metallica, that would still have like a sellout crowd? Actually, when we saw Metallica a few years ago, it wasn't sold out. I'm just, what I mean? Like I'm just wondering, like how has metal evolved?
I think Metallica and Pearl Jam, when they came around, sold out in the arena in Buffalo.
Well, that's because people in Buffalo have nothing better to do. What do you think? Do you think it's those factors I mentioned that just like the economy's worse, and that like a lot of the bands that we're into, like the younger crowds aren't into? Because we were going to those sold out shows, when we were fresh into that music, not now when like these kids, like you could tell that like maybe a fourth of the crowd was there to see Suicide Silence, because they're like the new hot thing. Like, and Machine Head were like the old guys. So I'm just wondering if like are we just getting like we've moved past the popular stuff, and now we're just going to like we're like the loyal hardcore fans that support the long running bands. What do you think?
I have no clue. I just noticed that shows. I don't know if it's me or that the people don't seem to go as crazy, or we haven't been to the right shows. I don't know. Think of the old school punk shows where thrash got the whole like crazy crowd mentality thing from, where everybody's jumping on stage, everyone's jumping in the crowd, it's a whole pile of people. Maybe going to concerts lost that vitality for some reason.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe clubs are being more anal about security, and people get hurt for liability. I don't know what it is.
But you know what I'm saying, though, right? Like compare. Remember the show you went to here in Richmond that we talked about in the first episode with In This Moment and all those like new trendy metal bands. And compare like that crowd. And that was like a whole day festival show with like tons of bands. That you'd think that would draw like a big crowd, but it was like there were people there, but not like it wasn't sold out. Definitely. Compare that to like the first.
The Whitney artists here, they were like huge. In this moment, the biggest one. So it's
like compare that to when we saw, like, think about back when we saw like I don't know, like Soulfly for the first time, or when we saw Deftones, or when we saw like Fear Factory and Static X and like those shows. Remember like a 930 Club and Nation and stuff, like they were packed to the
yeah.
like people were being forced out the door. It was so crowded in there, and like the whole place was going nuts. I just haven't seen that since, and I'm just wondering if that still happens, or if that's we were like part of the last movement of super excited rabid metal fans. I just don't know.
I have no clue, dude. I have no idea on the subject. Great if someone has ideas they could send us. So one or two
Yeah.
people who listen,
If you're listening and you have some insight or feedback on that, I'd love to know. If you're going to shows and they're all sold out and great vibe in the air, I want to go to those shows. So tell me where they're happening and who's playing them. Last section of the show. What do you know about Dave that's upcoming, or what can you recommend in the music world?
I don't know. I'm reading some reviews of the Limp God's album. They're saying that it's similar vibe to the other stuff, but still really good. Can't wait to someday buy it. I still haven't even bought God Forbid the last one. And then Megadeth too. I'd love to great thrash metalcore albums out. I need to stop buying lesser bands and that stuff. What else? Soulfly has one coming out. So does Slipknot.
The only thing that I am anticipating is a lot of these metal stars. Because I read the PRP and Blabbermouth every day, which are metal news websites, and they're always posting stories now. Like somebody, like Randy from Lamb of God or Dez from Devil Driver or somebody is always going on about the state of the music industry, and that now like. David Grohl on his Grammy acceptance speech said something about the music industry and like what people really want. And there's this, and like Trent Reznor like gave this great interview recently about the industry and like what needs to change and like how he fits into it and stuff. And like there's just so much chatter in the music world about the industry and about like file sharing and legal downloading and like what it all means and like what's happening. I'm very anxious for either everybody to just like shut up and like do something, or I'm looking forward to and anticipating like the next step, the next evolutionary step of the music business and the internet in terms of music, because right now it feels like we're in this like huge transitionary, that's not the right word, transitional time. There's a lot of, and like with all the SOPA and PIPA acts that we're going to go through, or that were being talked about, and like just all this stuff is all kind of like stemming out of the same thing, which is the internet and how it's changed the face of everything, including music. And I'm really curious about like what's going to happen next, because right now it just seems like there's a lot of ideas, there's a lot of talk, and like nothing's happening. And right now like the music industry is kind of just, it's still functioning the way it was, even though everybody's saying it's dead. So like what's next, Like, and I think people like Trent Reznor and Billy Corgan and like the ones who were kind of self-made originally, and then became part of the system and then broke from the system, and then, or like Radiohead too, or a good example, and bands like that were like independent and then they were mainstream, and now they're like still hugely popular, but also like also going back towards independence and kind of like rewriting the rules on stuff.
Yeah.
I want to see more artists and like take a cue and like take matters into their own hands instead of just bitching about it. Like Randy from Lamb of God, that guy apparently is quite the ranter, but he's like becoming completely incoherent about what he thinks needs to happen with music. He just cusses a lot and like says a lot of stuff that doesn't make sense.
He must have been to a bunch of Pantera shows by the end of Pantera's career. Learned a lot from Phil, didn't he?
Yeah, right.
Not much else to say. I think the Billy Corgan says he believes the modern rock album is dead, and he says why he's doing the thing he's doing.
Yeah.
With the Smash Pumpkins, there's a whole change in artists and albums, and there's still with all the MP3s, it's different. Yeah, it used to be, so we'll see.
So speaking of the evolution of metal, this episode's song pick is going to be by an artist who has come a long, long way and evolved in ways that I never expected her to. This is a song by a new band from Ontario, Canada, I believe close to Toronto, called Sumo Cyco. And Sumo Cyco is fronted by the former pop rock singer Skye Sweetnam, who has been on a number of Disney soundtracks and put out a couple of solo albums. Now, her second solo album was one that really caught my attention. It was definitely kind of a pop rock kind of album. However, it was very darkly tinged. It had some really, really heavy riffs in it. Also coupled with a lot of electronic beat loops and such, but it was definitely hovered on the heavy side, and I was really curious about where she was going with her stuff at that point. And then she starts this Sumo Cyco band, who apparently is sort of like an alter ego project for her. All the band members go by stage names. They have a lot of horror movie imagery on their website and their videos. They do a lot with, like B horror kind of zombie, vampire, goth kind of stuff. So definitely go check out their YouTube page. Check them out at sumocyco.com, because that is SUMOCYCO.com. They are a burgeoning new band. They're a really interesting sound, kind of a mix of pop, metal, a little bit of punk, and a very surprising turn for a former pop star. So I'm really interested to see where they take this, and check them out. This is Sumo Cyco with their song Limp.
Never take the time.
the main website for this podcast is bumusicast.wordpress.com. Please leave us feedback there in the comments section, or please email us at breathingunderwater1@gmail.com. You can also follow us on Twitter at breathingunder, but I'm only really going to post when we have a new episode available. Other than that, there's not going to be much other web presence for now. I'm just trying to keep things simple. So if you need to contact us, WordPress or email is probably the best bet.
All views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the persons expressing them and have no relation to the companies, artists, or bands discussed.
In addition, the participants of this podcast claim no rights or ownership of the musical media, songs, sound clips, etc. presented in this podcast, which are solely for promotional purposes. If there are any issues with any content presented in this podcast, please contact us and we'd be happy to take care of it.
So please do not sue us or be a hater.
Thanks for listening.